This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
And where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of the Naked Mormonism podcast with me, Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. This is somewhat of a monumentous occasion, possibly even a milestone. At least, right now it sure feels like it is. The podcast has been doing well enough to make it into the double-digit episode numbers. I know, everybody hold your applause. I wasn't sure how well everything would turn out, as I was getting into the swing of what the show was morphing to be. But I'm really feeling positive about how it's being received, and I owe all of the success to Satan. Don't you hate it when somebody does something well due to practice or hard work and they thank God for it? Or even worse, when a movie star or famous singer says, "Thank God for my gifts and fame and glory." Don't you want to just slap their fucking faces off? When you look at it, it's like, no. God did not give you this. You got those things because of working hard and practicing at whatever it is you're good at. And when people like what you do, they pay attention to you, providing the fame you're currently basking in. God doesn't fit anywhere in that model, and the gratitude is misplaced when the person throws God's dick into the equation. Why not thank the fans, or the people that have helped the person attain success along the way? That's a much better explanation for their success, and it has a foundation that actually makes sense. So, I guess I won't thank Satan for this, milestone of 10 episodes that I'm considering a success, but I will thank every single listener. I fucking love you guys, and I owe any success the show experiences to you alone. So thank you for listening, and I really hope you continue to join me in this journey of research wherever it may lead us. In addition to this personal milestone, the patronage is going pretty well. In fact, I have a new Namo apostate to thank, Logan P. Logan has decided that his life is meaningful and, inversely, his eternity is meaningless enough to become a Namo apostate. No longer will Logan sit idly by and watch true believing Mormons wallow in their own ignorance, because he cares about his fellow humans enough to give support to a door that offers a path to true knowledge of Mormonism and, incidentally, apostasy. Logan could only do this because of his superior wisdom and wit, and will forever have a place at the Namo table inside the gratitude-laden heart of the podcast. Thank you for your support, Logan. That's all I have this week for patronage. No new translation story like Julie got in episode 9, so I suppose I'll just jump right into the history, right after I'm mentioning to check out the Naked Mormonism Facebook page and Twitter page, or email me directly about your thoughts on the show by going to the website at nakedmormonismpodcast.com. And I'm also trying to get the show to reach a legitimate milestone that somebody else put on the show, and that's 100 Facebook likes. So if you really want to help the show attain that goal, check out the Facebook and click the like button, which I'd really appreciate. And I guess that's pretty much wraps up the sales pitch for today. Last episode was an examination of Joe getting the plates out of the ground and back to the Smith house. There are a few conflicting accounts of how this happened, but apparently he was attacked by 2 or 3 guys with or without guns, and he knocked them the fuck out with single God-infused super punches of doom. After being attacked by these 3 guys, while he was holding 50-pound metal plates, Joe suffered an injury fighting off the last guy. He hurt his thumb, sort of, a little bit. Whether the reported story is accurate or not, it did serve to unite the entire Smith family under the rule of Almighty Joseph Jr. Further persecution regarding the plates only made things worse. Well, in the case of the genesis of Mormonism, better. This persecution made the Smith family believe in Joe's contrived bullshit even more. We ended last episode with Joe getting home with the plates. So, this episode we need to talk about the middle time between when Joe got the plates home and when he moved to Harmony, Pennsylvania, to get set up on a farm with the help of his father-in-law Isaac Hale. It was on this farm, adjacent to the Hales, that was previously owned by Jesse Hale, who was Emma's older brother, that some of the Book of Mormon was actually translated in. One person we'll need to talk about quite a bit in this episode is not-so-smarty Martin Harris. You see, when it comes to building an empire, there are a few key ingredients. Everything must start with the person that has a new idea or is a visionary, right? The idea this person has can be synthesized from multiple other factors around the visionary at the time of his leadership genesis, or the idea can be completely original and cut from whole cloth, which is much more rare when you're talking about cult leaders. Well, when we look at Joseph Smith, it's easy to tell that he pulled his ideas from a lot of surrounding features in his time. There were a lot of examples of churches cropping up around him and in the burned over district while he was growing up, so he was no stranger to seeing how starting a religion was done. There were plenty of examples around. And there were tons of these religious leaders that were somewhat successful and may have converted a few minds to their specific brand of Christianity, but nothing significant. But in contrast to that, there were also the very successful mega churches that started up and thrived in the area around Joe. They were gathering massive followings behind these charismatic and influential church leaders. Well, Joe was a genius when it came to learning from other people's mistakes, and likewise their successes. So during this hypothetical empire's construction, this visionary with the idea has to have the right-hand man. This person has to handle all the small details that the big picture visionary can't waste his precious time doing. We established this person to be Oliver Cowdery, or as we know him, Cowdung all over. Cowdung combined with a man of action, who was D-Day David Whitmer, and a beginning recruitment of followers, which consisted of the rest of the Whitmer family, Joseph had some of the essential pieces for starting a true groundswell movement that could later be built into his own little empire. Countless small grassroots movements that have happened throughout all time have started with all of these essential pieces, and they possibly even gained some followers, but these small groups failed to adapt to the larger scale for one key reason: lack of resources. So when an empire like Mormonism is in its early construction phases, it doesn't require much in regards to resources or means. But the more it expands, of course, the more of a resource black hole the empire becomes. Thus, the resource demand overcomes the current supply, and the initial fire the early movement began with consumes itself in its own intensity and burns itself out. So, how can this inevitable vacuum be overcome? By finding a bankroller. The bankroller is a vital piece of the hierarchy structure inside of an empire. And the earlier in the incubation period the bankroller comes along, the better and the faster that the empire can grow. When it comes to getting the funding for the movement, the beginning members and this visionary have a few choices, both for finding the guy with the money and for how to include him once he does ante up his piece of the investment. The first and most lucky hypothetical person to get to help these people build an empire would be somebody with a very large inheritance, and they have no idea what to do with their money yet. They would make for an easy target, and it's not too hard to conceal the operations of this empire behind a veil from people that are unfamiliar with the business world, which people with large inheritances frequently are. So the next best person after that to fund an operation like this would be a rich and credulous man whom could be convinced of the veracity of the product he's financing and effectively the empire he's building. Usually, these people are easily swayed by new trends and ideas, and they can quickly become a problem for this empire that's building instead of being the first and best fitting solution. So a slightly harder way to finance the empire is getting the money from a smart businessman who has a self-made kingdom of riches which he guards with his life. These people usually try to verify their investments into the empire all along the way for fear of being swindled. Most of these wise investors will pull out at the first red flag with what they've bought into, but not all investors are capable of cutting their losses and licking their wounds after being convinced they've been taken. Oftentimes, the investor will fall into a negative feedback loop of thinking the more money he puts into the investment, the better it will get. He just has to pass a certain threshold maybe before it starts paying off. But this vicious loop has driven countless millions of investors into bankruptcy due to lots of small bad decisions. They seem so small when they happen, but they quantify into one huge mistake and a financial life lost. So, where did Not So Smarty Marty fall on that hypothetical scale that I just proposed? Well, he was kind of all three of them to a certain extent. His wealth had initially come from a handsome inheritance, and he was a fairly smart businessman, but was very vulnerable to the wheelings and dealings of charlatans because of his incessant credulity. So this puts him mainly in the second category described. He was a prime target and ripe for the hustle Joe was about to throw at him. In addition to that, he also had built on his investments, and he was a very wise businessman that was very honest in all of his business dealings, as recounted by many, many people around him. So he didn't just start with this large inheritance, he had also taken one talent and multiplied it to 10. So I covered Not So Smarty Marty and Joe's interactions and meetup in episode 3, but I'm going to rehash it again along with some other details and interviews on this episode and go beyond that to the translation. Doing this will set up the storyline for the witnesses of the gold plates, and we'll see how each person plays their role in getting the cash out of Marty at the most crucial possible moment. Let's recall what some of the people around Marty thought about him. A biographer wrote that, quote, his imagination was excitable and fecund. For example, Marty once perceived a sputtering candle to be the work of the devil. An acquaintance said that Harris claimed to have seen Jesus in the shape of a deer and walked and talked with him for 2 or 3 miles. The local Presbyterian minister called him, quote, a visionary fanatic. A friend who praised him as being, quote, universally esteemed as an honest man, end quote, also declared that Harris's mind, quote, was overbalanced by marvelousness, end quote, and that his belief in earthly visitations of angels and ghosts gave him the local reputation of being crazy. Another friend said, quote, Martin was a man that would do just as he agreed with you, but he was a great man for seeing spooks, end quote. I wonder why Marty was susceptible to the advances of Joe and the entire Smith family. He knew the reputation of the family. He lived in Palmyra, where the Smith family resided at the time. When Marty's brother Persevered Harris was told about the Golden Bible business, Marty even said, quote, the first time I heard of the matter, my brother Persevered Harris, who had been in the village of Palmyra, asked me if I had heard about Joseph Smith Jr. having a Golden Bible. My thoughts were that the money diggers had probably dug up an old brass kettle or something of the kind. I thought no more of it. This was about the 1st of October, end quote. Marty still found it necessary to investigate the matter of the Golden Bible for himself. I suppose any businessman should probably learn as much about his investment before making it, but at this time, it was just a pie-in-the-sky claim made by the quote-unquote money diggers that Marty thought to be false. I always wonder why he would continue on associating with Joe, even after he investigated the whole story for himself. And for that matter, why would he buy further into the story that Joe was selling him, even after all of these red flags that Joe was setting off? What motivates a bankroller to believe in the product he's funding, no matter how poor of a decision of the investment was in retrospect? Hopefully, we can properly address these questions by the end of the episode. One person that was a fellow money digger with Joe, but generally trusted by the Smith family, was a guy named Alva Beeman. This guy was pretty clever and helped the Joe family out of a jam. Right before Marty got involved, and right after Joe got the plates home safe, the rumors of the Golden Bible were spreading like wildfire. The most sinister of these rumors and persecutions were coming from Joe's fellow money diggers. But Alva Beeman was a digger as well that was in the company that Joe was head of at the time, but he was on the inside of the Smith family loop, which was collectively opposed to the other, more greedy money diggers. This group that had been following Joe's seeing powers for the last few years had shared equally in everything they did up to this point, which basically amounted to running small-time scams and rackets for chump change, right? Well, they were bound and determined to get their fair share concerning the plates, and they were going to do it by any means necessary. Willard Chase, who we heard from in the last episode, was one of the members of this jolly bunch of assholes and wanted to take the plates by force. Why don't we just put ourselves to see how things went down? Alva Beeman had just arrived from Livonia, New York, which was about 35 miles away from Palmyra, to help Joe with some of the more crazy money diggers that were cropping up, that were quote-unquote persecuting Joe at the time. I'm not certain if Joe summoned him, or if the rest of the Smiths did, or if Alva just got word that Joe finally had the plates and he was coming to have a look for himself. Regardless, he gets to the Smiths and helps them with an old Ontario glass box, which was a wooden box used for carrying windows, by cutting off the sides to make a more fitting size box for the plates. Mary Beeman, Alva's daughter, concurs Alva's attendance in the Smith home that night. Quote, "Father," meaning Alva, "became acquainted with Father Joseph Smith, the father of the prophet. He frequently would go to Palmyra to see Father Smith and his family. During this time, Brother Joseph Smith came in possession of the plates which contained the Book of Mormon. As soon as it was noised around that there was a golden Bible found," for that was what it was called at the time, "the minds of the people became so excited, and it arose at such a pitch that a mob collected together to search the house of Father Smith to find the records. My father was there at the time and assisted in concealing the plates in a box in a secluded place where no one could find them." End quote. And that was recounted from Lucy's book, page 392. So Joe got a tip from somebody that this mob of money diggers was coming to storm the Smith house and take the plates by force. And when Joe arrived at home, he asked his mother Lucy if a mob had been there yet that day. Lucy replied that nobody had been there today and that she had been there for the entirety of the day. Joe knew that there was going to be a mob coming for the treasure any time now, and knew they had to be concealed. Enter Alva Beeman. The family, with Alva's help, fashioned this box together for the plates, and Alva was even permitted to feel the plates through the pillowcase they were being concealed in at the time. But he never saw them uncovered, much like the 11 witnesses and everybody else who ever claimed to see the plates. Joe needed a good hiding place for these plates, so they lifted some bricks out of the hearthstone in order to bury the plates underneath the house to conceal them inside of their box. Lucy recounts that they had just finished laying the bricks back in the hearthstone when the armed mob arrived at the Smith property line. The family knows that if the mob gets inside, they will tear the house apart and eventually find the plates and take them. So they need a plan. Joe gathers all of the men around the front door and begins devising a strategy. On the other side of this door is a mob of possibly a dozen or more people This group includes Willard Chase, Samuel Lawrence, Josiah Stawell, as we knew him, Bossman Joe, and a bunch of other money diggers from that same crew that Joe owed money to, or, even a share of the plates, which was promised. They had rifles and divining rods and looked like a dangerous group. In every Mormon movie, this group of persecutors is depicted as a surly and evil group, when really, they were Joe's best friends only months before this incident, and Joe looked just like them. But the problem is, they're fucking crazy, and they really believe the shit that Joe is claiming about these ancient gold plates to be true. So, how does one disperse a mob of drunkard magic men hell-bent on getting the biggest haul of their lifetime? These men have no honor, no reservations or affinity for one another, as made apparent by Joe's backstabbing practices. And I would even make an argument that, by today's standards, most of the people in this mob would likely be spending their days inside of a padded room with a straitjacket for some of the batshit they did and said. So, how does Joe beat them this time? He's cornered. Well, he out-crazies them. The mob's waiting outside with rifles in hand and yelling at Joseph to bring the plates out and nobody gets hurt. But Joe has a plan of his own devised on the other side of the door. He gets all of the men in the house gathered together in a small, tight group at the front door where the mob is sure to enter. And just as the mob gets to the front door, Joe throws it open and commands all the Smith men down to 11-year-old Don Carlos, along with Alva Beeman, to charge the frustrated and now utterly confused mob with all their fury and might. He did this in the way that a general would command a line of infantrymen into a bloody grindhouse range in front of an enemy gun emplacement. All of the men run out of the house and shouting and throwing rocks and making as much noise and confusion as possible throughout the mob to break it up. You see, when you're camping or hiking and you encounter a bear that decides to fuck with you, there are a few things to do correctly and incorrectly. And whatever you do may have an impact on whether you leave the confrontation with that bear with your life or not. As it does vary between types of bear, the exact best thing to do will be dictated by the situation and the bear itself. But one thing you do when a bear charges you is put up your hands, make a fierce-looking face, avoid eye contact, and stand your motherfucking ground. Statistically speaking, the bear will feign on its charge and go around you at the last second before actually colliding with you. That's because bears are predatory creatures, much like us. And we don't want to deal with prey that'll stand its ground. We would much rather chase something until we, as a predator, can take an advantage at the back of the prey while it's running away from us. This same trend that happens with bears occurs in the same way with people. I'm convinced that if the mob would have stood its ground when the men were charging out of the house, this whole night would have gone down differently. But Joe's orchestrated bluff charge landed exactly how he intended it, and the mob collapsed and broke apart in this confusing and ballsy tactic. These money diggers were a fearful mob, and if they believed for 1 second that they would be overpowered at all, they gave up their post. And that's what happened when these possibly 8 unarmed men charged a mob that was almost twice their size and armed with rifles. If I were a God-fearing man, I would say those men defending Joe had God on their side and were able to drive the evil opposition from their presence only thanks to the strength from the Lord. But, quite frankly, that just adds an extra step. We all know a crazy motherfucker sometime in our life. Somebody that just don't give a fuck about anything, whom you would never want to fight, even if you had the upper hand. Because you know that crazy beats the shit out of big or skilled every time. So Joe's overkill dose of crazy was just what this situation needed to come to a close in the Smith family's favor. And after this seemingly fateful charge, the mob was gone and the Smith family retreated safely into their household after the charge. But something still lurks in the battlefield. A destructive torpedo fired from friendly ranks that slipped under Joe's radar is officially in the water. and it's bearing down on a defenseless Joe and his vulnerable golden treasure. Treason in the ranks of a trusted individual near the family has the potential to bring this all down to its knees before it ever gets started by exposing Joe and his secret false plates to his entire family in front of Alva Beeman and Samuel Lawrence. We'll get into that in a second, but I need to throw out a little backstory on Samuel Lawrence so we can understand exactly what happens here. I've made reference to that name a couple of times, but we don't know Samuel very well, so let's get a proper introduction right now. Samuel Tyler Lawrence was one of the many people in the Money Digger group that Joe and Big Daddy Cheese were in, which Joe later came to be the leader of before acquiring the plates. But let's back up to 1823 really quickly. 4 years before our current setting, Joe had been visited in his room by the angel Nephi, which is now recounted as Moroni, and was told he would be getting the plates out of the hill Cumorah on September 22nd. Now, this is just how it was recounted in the 1838 Joseph Smith dissertation. There are a lot of problems with this story, but that's not what I'm trying to talk about right now. Our focus is the part Samuel Lawrence has to play regarding the plates. When Joe tried to get the plates in 1823, he couldn't, and the spirit told him to come back in black clothes with a black horse and demand the plates in a certain name, along with his oldest brother Alvin Smith. Alvin died in late 1823, before Joe could get the plates with Alvin in September 1824, the following year. During the 1824 visit, the spirit told Joe to bring a person with him, and he would know who that person would be when he saw them. In 1825, Samuel Lawrence was revealed as this person that Joe needed to bring along to successfully exhume the plates from their millennia-long resting place. When Joe and Sam get to the hilltop on September 22nd, some pretty amazing stoned sight happens between the two of them. This is from the affidavit of Willard Chase. Quote, Joseph believed that one Samuel T. Lawrence was the man alluded to by the Spirit, and went with him to a singular-looking hill in Manchester and shewed him where the treasure was. Lawrence asked him if he had ever discovered anything with the plates of gold. He said no. He then asked him to look in his stone to see if there was anything with them. He looked and said there was nothing. He told him to look again and see if there was not a large pair of specks with the plates. He looked and soon saw a pair of spectacles, the same with which Joseph says he translated the Book of Mormon. Lawrence told him it would not be prudent to let these plates be seen for about 2 years. Not long after this, Joseph altered his mind and said Lawrence was not the right man, nor had he told him the right place. End quote. So we have Joe failing 2 years in a row, and he thought that he might be able to bring along a treasure seeker buddy to help his chances of doing the plate acquisition ritual correctly this year. If I followed the conversation correctly, Joe said that it was just the plates on the hill, and Samuel asked Joe if he had ever found anything with the plates. Upon Joe's negative reply, Sam goaded him into looking into his seer stone again to see if Joe didn't see a pair of spectacles accompanying the plates this time. When Joe looked into his stone after Sam encouraged him to, he saw the specks along with the plates. Now Joe knew Sam knew where the plates were supposedly buried, because he just brought Sam in for some consultation, but Sam ended up telling Joe all about how he should treat the plates once they were pulled from the earth, and somehow made Joe see something that he didn't know was in the box with the plates up to this point, the spectacles. This is the first mention of the Urim and Thummim being in the box, being called spectacles as opposed to the Urim and Thummim. Soon after this little 1825 interaction with Joe and Samuel, Joe changed his mind about the whole Lawrence thing and told all of his treasure-seeking buddies that Sam was full of shit, and he didn't actually know where the plates were buried. That was Joe's job and calling in life, and nobody was going to take it from him. Once Sam got the boot as the holy guy Joe needed to help him get the plates, Joe looked into his stone again to see who the real person would be to help him get the plates from the ground, and Joe saw Emma Hale as the one. This motivated Joe to take her to wife, so he could get some and get the plates, along with her help in 1827, which, as we learned last episode, he supposedly did. Samuel Lawrence has one other claim to fame in this time period before we get to the next scene with the Smith family, Alva Beeman, and Samuel Lawrence. After Joe pulled the plates from the ground and left them in a log, he was called to Macedon, New York, about 5 miles from Palmyra, to do work on a well. Joe didn't realize that the whole job was a farce set up by his money digger pals to sneak the plates out from under Joe's nose without his knowledge. When Joe was away from town working, the money diggers needed somebody who had been to the hill with Joe so they would know where to start looking to find the plates that were stashed in the log. Enter once again Samuel Lawrence. He was the man who helped them. So Emma, knowing of this, rode a stray horse to Macedon to tell Joe about this impending treachery and to tell him that the plates might be in danger, because she knew who was in that group of seers, as well as their potential for stealing the plates. So Joe looks into his hat and says the plates are safe for now, and then borrows a horse from his current employer, who was just a complete hoax set up anyway, and rides home with Emma to get back to the plates so he can secure them from their log hiding place. He gets them home and the money diggers get pissed, and here we continue our story. After the mighty Smith bum rush to scare away the armed mob that wanted the plates from Joe, Alva Beeman returns to the Smith house a little while later, maybe a couple hours, maybe a couple days, it's not really clear. Only this time, Samuel Lawrence, presumably one of the people that was in the mob earlier, was accompanying Alva at this time, and Joe was about to get a nasty third degree from the two of them. Samuel and Alva try everything they can possibly think of to strike a deal with Joe for the plates. They offer Joe money and possessions and all manner of every possible thing they can think of to get Joe to willingly offer them the plates. But Joe knows that he can't give them up, no matter how tempting the offer or how high the cost. Throughout an onslaught of bargaining, Joe bracingly stonewalls the two money diggers out of any possible opening, for understandable reasons from today's perspective. He couldn't let the men see the plates uncovered, because that would expose Joe as a fraud to everybody in the house. He couldn't make a deal with them to pacify their interest in the plates, because Sam and Alva knew how much money there would be in an ancient gold plates, so they weren't looking to get the runaround from Joe this time. So how did a resolution come about? Remember that torpedo that's already in the water that I mentioned earlier? Well, it's about to make contact with the entire foundation of the family relationship with Alva Beeman and Samuel Lawrence. Alva, who had helped stash the plates under the house by digging up some of the hearthstone bricks, pulled out his divining rods in frustration. He lifts them up in the air and commences his usual ritual of treasure seeking with the rods. This may have been a spell that he said over the rods, or a certain mindset he had to get into, but regardless, he put on a show for everybody in the house, including Samuel Lawrence. Holding tightly to his precious and favorite divining rods, Alva brought them down from over his head and points them straight at the hearthstone, stating that the plates are exactly there. What happens next is nothing short of amazing. Unfortunately, we don't have explicit record of how the confrontation went, but we do know what happened to the plates. Joe had removed them from under the house because he feared the mob would return and tear the house apart looking for the plates. So, presumably, when Sam and Alva pulled the loose bricks out of the hearthstone, they found the empty place underneath the house where Alva had helped them stash the plates, but they were nowhere to be found. Joe presumably told them the fucking ground gnomes moved the plates to safety, so it sucked to be them. And Sam and Alva left the Smith household that day empty-handed and even more frustrated with Joe's sleight of hand that Joe pulled right in front of them once again. But where were the plates? The plates were actually physical at this time, and Joe had to deal with the fact that they had to be somewhere at all times. So, where did they go to escape the clutches of Sam and Alva? Luckily, Lucy details this for us. Quote, Joseph soon received another intimation of the approach of a mob and the necessity of removing the record and the breastplate again from its hiding place. He took them up and carried them out to a cooper shop across the road and took them out of the box, and after wrapping them up carefully in cloths, laid them away in the midst of a quantity of flax which was stowed in the shop loft. He then nailed up the box as before, and tore up the floor and put the box under it. That was from Lucy's book, which is just an edited memoir from Lucy, edited by Lavina Fielding Anderson. Joe was ready this time for them to try and steal the plates, and he wouldn't be outsmarted. So he took the plates out of the glass box, which was just, a relatively small wooden box for carrying old windows in, and hid the plates, and presumably the breastplate, up in the loft of the Smith's cooper shop, which was just a little shed that they had on a part of their property. After hiding the treasure, Joe hid the empty but sealed and untampered with looking box underneath the floorboards in the cooper shop. Lucy continues in her memoir, quote, In the next morning we found the floor of the cooper shop taken up, and the wooden box which was put under it split into pieces. And in a few days we learned the cause of this last move, and why their curiosity led them in this direction. A young woman, who was a sister to Willard Chase, had found a green glass, and by looking through it, she could see many wonderful things. And among the rest of her discoveries, she said she had found the exact place where Joe Smith kept his gold Bible hid. So in pursuance to her directions, they gathered their forces and laid siege to the cooper shop. End quote. So this Miss Chase referred to by Lucy is Sally Chase, who was Willard and Mason Chase's sister, and Willard and Mason were the guys that hired Joe and his older brothers Alvin and Hiram to help them dig a well, which Joe found his seer stone in. That was his favorite seer stone of all time that we heard about earlier. And of course, Willard Chase, we know, was a member of the glass-looking mob that was trying to get a hold of the plates. So he had a sister, Sally, and she was a revered glass looker, much like Joe and all of the Smith men were, for that matter. The Chase and the Smith family had a lot of interactions while they were both living in Palmyra, as the two families often engaged in the same practices. So the mob had returned a couple of nights after this little confrontation between Alva, Sam, and Joseph. But when Joe went out to check on the plates after the mob came through the night before, he found that the floorboards were ripped up where he had previously ripped them up to hide the box, and the box itself was smashed into 1,000 pieces. Luckily, the plates, along with the breastplate, apparently, were still sitting unharmed in the loft of the shop, which raises a question or two. So, if the mob was conducting a thorough search of the shed, and it was an entire mob, thorough enough to rip up some floorboards to look for their prize, how did they not think to look over their heads as well? And if they were under the direction of a true blue seer, who was Sally Chase, who directed them to the cooper shop and helped them find the box the plates were in, how could she not see that the plates were separated from the box and placed somewhere else in the shop? Did the mob find the box, smash it open to reveal nothing but air, and just give up on their search? These questions will haunt us indefinitely because we don't have any documentation telling us what happened with the mob or the plates that night. We're just told that Joe found the plates safe and sound where he left them in the loft the night before. The mob was still understandably restless after this fruitless search, and they became more and more of a nuisance to Joe and the entire family, in addition to spreading a lot of factual and infactual rumors about the family. Joe knew he had to get the plates translated, but he also knew he couldn't do so safely in Palmyra, without the mob of money diggers constantly breathing down his neck for a share of the plates, of course. What was Joe to do? He was in dire straits with no money to move him and his wife to Harmony, Pennsylvania, like he had agreed with his father-in-law. And he owed a substantial amount of money to various people for court rulings and business deals he fucked people over on. Most of the people that Joe was indebted or owed some piece of the plates to were the people who made up the mob that tried to take the plates by force. And most of these people didn't have jobs or any sort of livelihood, so they could just sit around the Smith property all day and harass Joe about his lies and his valuable gold plates. Let's not make any excuses for the persecution here, though. The Smith family was being threatened and harassed, and Joe himself had his life threatened multiple times lest he ante up on the plates. But all of this was Joe's fault. He was keeping the company of dishonest treasure hunters and thieves and had been telling them for some time now that he would soon acquire these golden plates. He was even telling various people that he would offer shares in the profits from the book if they helped him perform a simple task, or in Willard's case, make a lockbox for the book to be kept in. Everything the Smith family had to deal with was completely deserved based on Joe's actions. Let's propose a simpler and smarter way to go about this whole thing. If everything did indeed happen as Joe reports, maybe Joe could have gotten the plates in secrecy, translated them in secret with the help of some of the other Smiths, and took the translation in the plates to a religious or ancient scholar to publish his work and findings as a legitimate and authentically ancient sectarian text. Instead, Joe told hundreds of people for years that he had found gold plates stashed in the ground by ancient Christian inhabitants of this continent. And when it came time to authenticate his finding as real, Joe ducked and dodged every single attempt to verify his claims, and in the case of Martin Harris and Charles Anthon, Joe just blatantly denied and misrepresented the claims of the one scholar that did see some of the writings of the plates. My point is, how much further do we have to go before we can officially conclude that this whole thing was a farce? Joe was clearly a charlatan, and he exhibited all the traits of a burgeoning cult leader, but people still revere him as a holy prophet of God, just as he claimed, and it perpetuates today with a falsely inflated membership of over 15 million people. And I personally believe that as soon as a person claims divinity for themselves, we can instantly ignore any claim they make from that point on, because an omnipotent and omniscient God would never work through a human being like this. But we've seen countless examples throughout history of men claiming divinity or divine origination that have fallen into the same category of false holy man as Joe does. So let's answer the question from earlier. What was Joe to do in order to relieve all of these pressures that were building? Do what he was most accustomed to do in situations like this. Run away. This time to Harmony, Pennsylvania, some 270 miles away. But before Joe and Emma could run, Joe had to pay his debts to society, like I mentioned before. And here is where not-so-smarty Marty comes in, to play his first big role as a catalyst for the plates being translated. In episode 3, we talked about how Joe used the whole Smith family to swindle Marty in combination, and it worked like a charm. Let's hear Marty's retelling of his meeting with Joe, and then we'll jump a little further down in this Tiffany's Monthly interview in 1859 to see how this ended up working out in Joe's favor. Quote, "He told him to go and look in the spectacles, and he would show him a man that would assist him. That he did so, and he saw myself, Martin Harris, standing before him. That struck me with surprise. I told him I wished him to be very careful about these things. 'Well,' said he, 'I saw you standing before me as plainly as I do now.' I said, 'If it is the devil's work, I will have nothing to do with it. But if it is the Lord's, you can have all the money necessary to bring it before the world.' He said, 'The angel told him, that the plates must be translated, printed, and sent before the world. I said, Joseph, you know the doctrine, that cursed is every one that putteth his trust in man, and maketh flesh his arm. And we know that the devil is to have great power in the latter days to deceive, if possible, the very elect. And I don't know that you are one of the elect. Now you must not blame me for not taking your word. If the Lord will show me that it is his work, you can have all the money you want." End quote. 2 paragraphs down, Marty continues, quote, "The excitement in the village upon the subject had become such that some had threatened to mob Joseph, and also tar and feather him. They said he should never leave until he had shown the plates. It was unsafe for him to remain, so I determined that he must go to his father-in-law's in Pennsylvania. He wrote to his brother-in-law, Alva Hale, requesting him to come for him. I advised Joseph that he must pay all his debts before starting. I paid them for him, and furnished him money for his journey. I advised him to take time enough to get ready so that he might start a day or two in advance, for he would be mobbed if it was known when he started. We put the box of plates into a barrel about 1/3 full of beans and headed it up. I informed Mr. Hale of the matter, and advised them to cut each a good cudgel and put it in the wagon with them, which they did. It was understood that they were to start on Monday, but they started on Saturday night and got through safe. This was the last of October 1827. It might have been the 1st of November." End quote. Joe was great at getting money out of Not-So-Smarty Marty, and the $50 plus journey expenses was only the beginning. Joe and Emma had agreed with Emma's father, Isaac, to stay with the family in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and the time had finally come that was do or die with Joe, Emma, and the plates. So Alva Hale, Emma's brother, came to Palmyra with a wagon and moved Joe and Emma to Pennsylvania with the plates safely concealed in a barrel full of beans. And this is where Mormonism was truly cultivated and birthed. This was the most crucial move of Joseph's life. He just had to get the Book of Mormon printed by any means necessary, and he would solidify his place throughout the annals of history. When the newlyweds arrived at the Hale household, Isaac wanted to see the plates that had stirred up so much commotion among the locals in Palmyra, and, of course, the money diggers, but ended up a little disappointed in what he was shown. But I don't want to put words in Isaac's mouth, so let's hear what he has to say in his 1834 affidavit, printed in Mormonism Unveiled by E.D. Howe. Quote, "I was informed they had brought a wonderful book of plates down with them. I was shown a box in which it is said they were contained, which had, to all appearances, been used as a glass box of the common-sized window glass. I was allowed to feel the weight of the box, and they gave me to understand that the book of plates was then in the box into which, however, I was not allowed to look." End quote. So Isaac Hale had the same problem as everybody else did when he viewed the plates in Joseph's box, and didn't get to see them uncovered. He probably was able to thumb the pages like almost everybody else was, but he didn't even explicitly state that he got that privilege. He only said that he was able to feel the weight of them in the box. For whatever reason, Isaac accepted Joe and Emma into his home for a short time, and then moved them out to another house that was adjacent to the Hale property that belonged to Jesse Hale, who had recently moved to Illinois and wasn't using the house anymore. Joe and Emma eventually bought the property from Isaac for $214 on April 6, 1829, even though they had been living in it for some time by that point on Isaac Hale and Not-So-Smarty Marty's dollar. It was a good thing that Marty was there to help the newlyweds get settled into a hospitable environment during the translation. Joe and Emma had arrived at their new home in late 1827, and Marty, who financed the move and paid Joe's other monetary obligations, arrived in Harmony in spring of 1828 to act as a scribe for Joe. For a little while, Emma had been writing what Joe was saying, but she couldn't always take the time to do it as she had other duties around the house she needed to attend to. Joe was also employed in little odd jobs around Harmony to keep a small income for him and his wife, or at least to keep some scraps of food on the table. But Marty changed all of that forever once he became the bankroller. He came to stay with the young Smith couple in Jesse Hale's house, making a total of 4 occupants once you include Emma's younger brother that was also living there. Marty's stay lasted from early spring to June 14th in 1828, and it involved translating what we know to be the Book of Lehi, which resulted in the 116-page manuscript, translated at a rate of about 1.5 pages per day. This manuscript was essentially the first book inside the Book of Mormon that it's divided into now, making 15 total books that comprise the Book of Mormon. It was supposedly translated from the small plates that constitute the first books inside the Book of Mormon, starting with 1st and 2nd Nephi and ending with Omni. Somewhere in there, assumingly before the first book of Nephi, the Book of Lehi, who was Nephi's father, was what constituted the 116 pages that Joe and Marty translated. This manuscript has never been found, and it's regarded by true-believing Mormons as very similar to 1st and 2nd Nephi, just written from a different perspective, with a little more backstory because it was written by Nephi's dad. Regardless, Joe lets Marty take home the manuscript after Marty begs Joe and God to let him do so. Joe puts the stipulation upon releasing the manuscript that Marty can't show it to anyone other than his immediate family. This is why it's believed that Lucy Harris, Marty's wife / first cousin, is the one who took the manuscript in order to test Joe's ability to reproduce the story he's made up so far. When all is said and done, Marty comes back to Joe empty-handed, having quote-unquote lost the 116 pages, and Joe and Marty are chastised for Marty's actions and lose their ability to translate for a few months. Joe never translates another page with Marty. I personally believe it's because Joe didn't want Marty to hear any of what Joe was going to translate to replace the 116 pages. Even though it was supposedly from a different set of plates and a different character's perspective based on similar events. It's all confusing, but it's all part of the Book of Mormon. And you know, the more I think back on this story, the more I wonder why Marty couldn't see the signs of a bad investment from the beginning. Or at very least, why didn't he acknowledge the harbingers of deceit as they reared their ugly heads? Marty knew the reputation of the Smith family, as well as personally regarded them as a dishonest family of treasure seekers. He heard the story about Joe and his golden plates and said that, quote, "The money diggers had probably dug up an old brass kettle or something of the kind. I thought nothing more of it," end quote. Marty went to the Smith household. This was after his wife and daughter had been there an entire day, 2 days before Marty went over there, just to be schmoozed and courted by the Smiths. Once Marty got there, he asked each Smith family member individually to relay the story of the plates and found the concurring testimonies to be enough evidence to pique his interest about the book. I mean, at very least, that's understandable. Why wouldn't you be interested, or at least curious about it? After meeting with the whole family, Marty meets with Joe himself to see if his testimony of the happenings surrounding the plates concurs with that of all of his family members. And coincidentally, it does. Imagine that. Because Joe made it all up and told his family exactly what to tell Marty to make the con happen successfully. And obviously, it worked. When Joe was translating with Emma as his scribe, Marty took the character's manuscript, which contained some scrawlings from the plates, to a professor at Columbus University in an effort to try and verify the authenticity of the ancient language inscribed on the plates. When Not-So-Smarty Marty met with Not-So-Smarty Marty's super-study smarty party pooper pal Charlie Anthon, Marty was told he was a sitting duck in Joe's con crosshairs, and that Marty should fucking hightail and bail ASAP. Even with this verifiable evidence that Joe was a fraud, Marty still persisted. Marty helped Joe translate these 116 pages without ever seeing the plates for himself or the translation method with his own eyes. Joe set up his desk in the corner of the room with the plates and all his props, and then sealed off his little area with a sheet hung from the ceiling and walls. Then, Joe proceeded to dictate what he read to Marty, sitting on the other side of said sheet. Once these 116 pages were lost, Joe couldn't reproduce what he had translated up to that point, and forbade Marty from ever helping him translate to ever again. Marty continued to fund the whole operation and living costs of the young couple while they were translating without him, and had no way of knowing what was going on with his investment during this time. But he still persisted to take this horrible wallet fucking that Joe repeatedly administered to him. All of the signs of a charlatan proposing a bad investment were there, and Marty didn't give no fucks about a single one of these signs. I have to think that he was reluctant at some point. There is truly no way he felt good and confident about anything that Joe was asking for, but he still ended up losing his farm and entire financial life to repay the printer's fee for 5,000 Books of Mormon that E.B. Grandin published. Why did Marty do it? I've been wondering why the entire time I've been researching Not So Smarty Marty. All the signs were there, and he still took the dive into shallow bullshit flowing over his inevitable rock bottom with complete reckless abandon. I want to say that people put in Marty's position that make the decisions that he made really deserve what happens to them in the wake of these horrible decisions. The only problem is when these poor decisions affect not only the bankroller that goes bankrupt, but the followers of the financed movement for generations to come. That's what happened to Mormonism. The brainchild of a madman, and the benefactor of generations of souls reaped through indoctrination. That's it for the meat of today's episode. I did want to say that I did have a little announcement. I was on an episode of the video podcast called Atheists on Air Beyond the Trailer Park. It was on January 12th. It was called Mormon Mania, and I really had a lot of fun with everybody involved there. It was like basically a Mormon criticism panel with Cash from Atheists on Air and David Michael from the My Book of Mormon podcast. So if you missed it, I recommend you check that show out. It was one of the most entertaining conversations I've ever been involved with in my entire life. We skimmed over a lot of very crazy Mormon topics and dove wristwatch deep into plenty of topics as well. The hosts, Deb and Beth, did a great job of keeping the show on track and asked a lot of really engaging questions that brought up some crazy Mormon shit. So please check out that show. It's just over 2 hours with a panel of 5 people that all hold the same opinion yet differing knowledge levels on the LDS Church. So I should also thank Heretic Woman for reaching out to me and inviting me to join that panel. It really couldn't have gone any better, and I had a lot of fun. So thank you, Heretic Woman. Next segment that I needed to talk about is listener mail. Well, there hasn't been anything that's been heavy criticism or anything that I really need to explicitly address. For the most part, everybody just seems pretty happy with what's going on, so I guess I'm not pissing anybody off right now, so I'll keep doing what I'm doing, and I guess I'll call that good. I did want to address the iTunes reviews really quickly, though. So far, the show has received 10 written reviews totaling an abundance of 5-star reviews, which I really appreciate, and just thank you to everybody that's taken the time to review the show. It really helps with the iTunes rankings to get the show higher up in the ranking system, which means more people will see the show, which is exactly what the show needs. The best way to support the show is through Patreon, but for those who don't want to give up their hard-earned dollars as a donation, leaving a positive iTunes review or a written comment is a great way to provide a different kind of support for the show. So thank you to everybody who takes time to help support the show or engages in the community or just takes the time to listen to what I have to say. I really appreciate it. It feels good. I'm really pleased with how things are going with the show. So thank you, everybody. Just as a heads up, this month's 3rd episode, I'm not going to charge patronage for, like usual. I only ever charge for 2. So it's going to be a free episode, so I'll be doing something a little bit different instead of the history. The episode that comes out around the 30th of January will be a Patreon teaser of a debate/conversation sort of thing that I had with my crazy fucking smart theist friend. Every time he and I get together, our conversations get pretty deep into theist versus atheist debating, and any conversations we have will be posted for patrons after I release this episode. But this upcoming episode of the debate will be just a little teaser, much like the D-Day David's An Address to All Believers in Christ was, but February episodes will return back to the historical analysis as usual. So I think that concludes this episode. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope to talk at you again here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.